Hey everybody, it's Miss Coretto, and I'm going to try this a little bit differently this time. You're going to have to watch me and listen to me, sorry about that, as we move on through our topic of evolution. You have already learned about Charles Darwin, the history behind the development of his theory, and also his thought process, like how did he come up with this idea of how life has changed through time. Today I want to provide you with some pieces of evidence. We're scientists, this is science class, we like evidence. So we're going to look at the lines of evidence that support Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So in our objectives list, we're going to describe how fossils provide evidence for evolution. We're going to look at anatomical evidence, and we're also going to look at the molecular record and how that provides evidence for Darwin's theory. So give yourself a status check, take a second, think about, could you do these things now? Give yourself a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then we will move on. So, the first line of evidence that supports Darwin's theory on evolution is the fossil record. Fossils are pieces of bones, pieces of organisms, whole bones that are put together by scientists. They could be imprints into rock. All different shapes and sizes fossils come in. And where scientists find them are in different layers of rock, typically sedimentary rock, which we'll talk about in a second. But what the fossil record has showed us is that through time, organisms have lived, organisms have been changing, and some have literally vanished, or what we know as have become extinct. And the fossil record has given us clues to those changes through time. They tell a story, essentially, fossils do. The scientists that study fossils or find fossils are called archaeologists. Really cool job if you're interested in something like that. And what they have been able to tell, the story is that the Earth is really old, and that life is old, and that life has certainly changed through time. If you took earth science, which most of you have, I believe, you probably learned about different types of rock, metamorphic, igneous, sedimentary. And sedimentary is where you find most of the fossils. Sedimentary is the layers of rock. And I just want to point out that the deeper the layer where you find a fossil, that typically means that that organism lived at an earlier time in life's history. So the deeper the layer, the older the organism or older the fossil, the more shallow the layer you find the fossil, in, the more recent that organism has existed on this planet. This is just showing over on the left-hand side examples of horse fossils that have been found through time of their forelimb, and then also their head. And what scientists do is they try to piece these fossils together, and then they try to put them in order. So it tells a story about the evolutionary history of the horse. And then to the right, this is an example of an evolutionary tree diagram that could be the result of the information gathered from fossils. So we can see the changes in time of horses, this being the modern day horse at the top, this being the ancestral horse way at the bottom, and all the different changes that have occurred. And these end nodes would be other horses, and they're now extinct because they're not in the present. So the fossil record, also I forgot to add this in, that you learned in earth science that scientists can radioactively label rock. They can actually determine, based on like the isotopes that they find in rock, how old rock layers are. So essentially, if they find an organism in that rock layer, they can also tell how old that organism is. So the fossil record has provided many clues to the evolution of species through time, and it showed us that there has been changes through time, and there's been extinctions through time as well. Number 2 is another line of evidence, and this is kind of more of a process centered line of evidence. That doesn't make much sense, but I'll try to explain it. That basically we can have organisms that live on 2 separate sides of the world and aren't closely related to each other. Now let me throw this out there. We are all related to each other by a common ancestor. We all came from one place. But we have closer relationships with some organisms than we do with others. But what this is saying is that Darwin saw, or scientists see, that we have organisms that live on total different sides of the planet, yet seem to have some similarities between them. And that's because the environment can actually drive organisms to become more similar. If you're exposed to the same environmental conditions, organisms have evolved traits to survive in those environmental conditions. A great example of this is the sugar glider that inhabits Australia, and the flying squirrel, which inhabits North America. Very similar in traits that they show, because North America and Australia have very similar environmental selective pressures. So over time, these organisms have started to almost reflect each other in regards to trait. So this is more of not a line of evidence that supports evolution as a whole, but a line of evidence that definitely shows that nature selects traits that are more favorable for their environment. So the whole idea of natural selection. This would not be one that you would want to use on a Regents exam if you're asked to supply a piece of evidence. This is not the one. I'll tell you the ones that you want to use. This next one's pretty cool. This line of evidence is comparing anatomical features or structural pieces of organisms. That organisms can have different structures on the surface, but internal structures can tell a story about common evolutionary ancestry. There's a couple different types of anatomical structures we can look at. We can look at what are called homologous structures. Homologous have different functions but similar structure, which means they probably came from some type of the same embryological tissue. So what this means is that they look a heck of a lot different on the outside, meaning, and they have very different functions. For example, the human arm, the cat limb or leg, I guess, the whale flipper, and the bat wing. These are homologous. They do not do anything the same, right? Our arm is used a lot differently than a bat wing is used. However, if we look on the inside, they have very similar structural anatomy. They have, where the red is circled, they have a long bone and short bone articulation. Long bone and short bone. Long bone and short bone. Long bone and short bone. So there definitely is like a common trend among these structures, and that's what they're called, homologous structures. They have very similar structure, same development in the embryo, and what it shows us is that we have a common ancestor. We have similarities with these organisms that proves that we came from the same place. Leaves are another example of homologous structures. So many variations on a common theme. Look at all the different types of leaves out there. And you might not have thought about this, but needles are leaves. Tendrils are leaves. Spines are leaves. These are all modifications of leaves or different types of leaves, but all serve, they don't all serve the same purpose in the sense that some are succulents, some store, some protect, but are an example of homology, common structures that show common ancestry. But don't be fooled. There is another set of structures called analogous structures. These are really neat. They have a similar structure and function on the surface, but they're very different on the inside. Examples of analogous structures would be wings. So for example, like a owl's wings versus a dragonfly wings. Why do they have wings? Why do these organisms evolve to have wings? Because they fly. So flying is the common theme. However, a bird and an insect are not closely related. So really what analogous structures are solving a similar problem with a similar solution. Another example is streamlined bodies. So you have a penguin, which is a bird, and a dolphin, which is a mammal, and they are not closely related. However, they both have streamlined bodies because they swim in the water and they need that reduction of friction. So it is a common solution to a common problem. So these do not show ancestry like homologous structures do. So just because organisms have very similar structures like wings doesn't mean they're closely related, is the point I want to get across. So again, just showing the very differences between the wings of a bat, a bird, and an insect. Vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are really interesting structures. These are structures that are remnants or structures that had important functions earlier in time but no longer do. They may be of little importance to an organism. So it just shows us that we have changed through time, that there's changes in our environment that have made it so we don't even need structures in our own bodies. Examples of vestigial structures would be our human appendix, which there's a lot of suggestion out there that our human appendix housed bacteria for the digestion of raw meat, which we don't typically have to do anymore. Our wisdom teeth are considered vestigial. We just have them removed. Some people, you could read tons of articles about this, and it's really interesting. Some scientists claim that some types of body hair are vestigial as well, that we don't need certain types of body hair anymore. Example in another species is the whale. Whales literally have remnants of hind limbs, like at one point showing that they walked on land. So those are vestigial. They clearly don't need those anymore, but they're still there. They're of a little importance. So it just shows that there's been change through time. Vestigial organs. Those are pretty cool. I'm going to skip over this, and maybe if you want to go back and watch this, this is a little piece of evidence about vestigial structures inside you. So take a few minutes. Actually, I'll say that. Why don't you watch it right now? Take a second and watch it, and I'll be back in 1 minute.